Good morning everyone and welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's 14th meeting of 2013. Can I remind everyone to set any electronic devices to flight mode or off, as this can interfere with the broadcasting and video conferencing equipment. Can we start this morning with introductions? At the table we have our clerking and research team together with official report, and around the room we are supported by broadcasting and the security office. As well as witnesses at the table, we also have Sarah Jackson of Working Families joining us by video conference. So good morning, Sarah, and thank you for joining us. Committee will have a number of questions this morning, so if you wish to come in and comment on any of the questions the committee are asking, if you could perhaps raise your hand and indicate, and we'll include you when we're taking the answers. So good morning again.
That's understood, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. My name is Mary Fee and I'm the committee's convener. Can I now ask members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting here on my right?
Good morning, Marco Biaggi, MSP for Edinburgh Central and Deputy Convener of the committee.
Good morning, Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West.
Matt Bagg, good morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Hi, Siobhan McMahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Alec Johnston, Member for North East Scotland.
Irina Dane, I'm the Chief Executive of the Scottish Out of School Care Network, which is a national organisation supporting the nearly 1,000 providers of out of school care for children in Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Jackie Brock, Chief Executive of Children in Scotland. We're a membership organisation, over 400 organisations and individuals who work or participate in children's services in Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Dr Margaret Ann Craig. I'm CEO of Cloud Biosciences, which is a spin-out from the University of Glasgow.
Good morning, I'm Satvat Rahman. I'm the Director of One Parent Families Scotland. We provide services and support for lone parents, and we also run flexible childcare services.
Good morning, I'm Claire Simpson from Parenting Across Scotland, which is a partnership of children's charities and other charities working together to provide a focus on parenting.
Good morning, I'm Maggie Simpson. I'm Chief Executive of Scottish Childminding Association. We're also a membership organisation with about 80% of childminders in Scotland as our members.
Good morning, I'm Claire Telfer, Head of Policy Advocacy and Campaigns with Save the Children in Scotland.
Thank you for that. Agenda item 1 today is an evidence session on women in work with a focus on childcare. And committee, as I say, have a number of questions for you. And I'm going to start with John Mason, who's going to ask questions on part-time working, and then move to John Finney with questions on childminding and supply and demand. John.
Thank you, Convener. I think it was reading Sarah Jackson's paper from Working Families that it brought one or two points to my attention. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at flexible working, part-time working, job sharing, that whole area. And I saw in your paper the suggestion specifically about the civil service that jobs were not being advertised as perhaps part-time, but in fact they might be when you investigated. And the idea of trying to increase the quality and level of part-time jobs, I think the suggestion was that they've been quite perhaps less well paid traditionally. And I just wondered, is it just the civil service you think should do this? Is this something we could do wider? Is it something that is reasonable for employers to be expected to do?
I think it's something that could be done much more widely. We'd like to see public sector generally advertising all jobs as suitable for flexible or part-time working, unless the hiring manager can make a very clear business case why not. The research we did just looked initially at civil service jobs. And what our researcher discovered was the vast majority were advertised as full-time, but when she picked up the phone and spoke to the department concerned, quite often they said, oh yes, if you'd like to talk to us about part-time or job share, we'd be open to that discussion. So we're pleased to see that the UK government has now said that in the Children and Families Bill that they're looking for civil service jobs to be consistently advertised as available for part-time or flexible working. We think this should be extended at the very least to the public sector, because government has got that power to impose that change, and then to influence the private sector and the third sector and hope that they will take that up as well, because what you're looking at is a barrier to people who've got caring responsibilities. Parents who've got disabled children, for example, or children generally, you can't wait for the 26 weeks that comes with the right to request flexible working. You need to know from the off that your working pattern is going to fit with your family and childcare needs.
A lot of employers think in terms of whole people, in the sense of I need one accountant or 2 cashiers or whatever it is, whereas in fact maybe they should be thinking I need 1.5 or I need 0.8. Is there maybe a need for a change in employers' thinking?
Yes, there's a need not just for a change in thinking, but I think a change in support and guidance, because you're right that employers tend to think of jobs in terms of Lego blocks. You know, every job is Monday to Friday, it's 35 or 40 hours a week. And actually what you need to do is start thinking about the role and what it needs to deliver to the organisation. So, and that may not be a 40-hour-a-week job. It may well be that you need somebody for 27 or 16, and then go out and find that set of skills for that number of hours. Don't restrict your talent pool or your recruitment pool by forcing everybody to fit that Lego brick model that is the default setting.
Okay, thanks very much. I don't know if anybody else has comments on that point.
I just want to come in and say I want to endorse what's been said. And I think it's particularly important to look at the support and guidance that's given to employers. One of the things we're finding around Parent Family Scotland is even employers who've been sympathetic to recruiting lone parents and providing a degree of flexibility in their working hours are now doing so in a way that's becoming quite difficult for them to be able to take up and sustain work. For example, we're seeing more jobs advertised in retail, which might only be for 16 hours, but they expect you to be available to work those hours any time during their opening hours, which could be from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So you have to say you're going to be available within those hours, which is very, very difficult for most parents, and particularly lone parents. So it's just to say that support and guidance, I think, is what we need, and maybe some exemplars of how employers can do it. So it still meets their business needs whilst providing the stability of knowing which hours you're going to be working for the families.
Claire, did you want to come in on that? I think you had indicated.
No, no, but in my paper, and just again to endorse it, and particularly to say that sometimes it's a little bit of flexibility that means that, say, someone can go in at 9:30 instead of 9, or be available to pick up their children. Quite often for employers, it's not actually a big change that's needed in terms of flexibility. And sometimes in terms of flexibility, where employers are flexible, parents, lone or 2-parent families can adjust their childcare to fit more easily. And so, yeah, if it were to be advertised, if people were to be under the new Children and Families Bill, the section that Sarah was talking about will be applicable UK-wide and will apply to Scotland. If people are allowed to apply for flexible working from day one, then they'll be able to arrange their childcare to fit.
Thanks. Well, does anyone else want to come in on that point?
Future questions are going to address students and flexibility around training opportunities and skills and development. Because if not, I think it is just worth logging the need for flexible childcare arrangements up front and known about in order to ensure that, particularly, I suppose, young parents, but other parents who may be taking on training and skills, upskilling, etc., need that flexibility of childcare, and because, of course, of their sort of flexible arrangements and to be in the college, the school day, the academic week. So I think the flexibility and availability of childcare to enable young women and their skills development, in particular, is a crucial issue that I would have thought you'd be interested in.
Sarah, did you want to come back in?
It was just a couple of points. One was to say that there's an opportunity to skill up Job Centre Plus advisors to try and get them working with local employers to think differently about what the job needs are, so that they don't automatically advertise everything as a full-time job. And the other is to say that Working Families has been working alongside a number of the UK-wide employer organisations like the Chambers of Commerce, and we've developed a strap line which very simply says happy to talk flexible working, and we'll be looking to pilot that this year, and the idea is to get employers to start using that on recruitment advertising so that an applicant knows that they can talk about the hours that would suit them at the point of application, that they don't have to wait until they've been offered the job, or wait until they've been in there 26 weeks, that you get the opportunity early on to have a grown-up conversation about what the business needs and what the employee needs.
Thanks for that. John, did you want to come back in on anything?
Not on that particular point. I don't know
if you want to move on to your other question.
Well, you want me to do that just now? Yeah, okay. I mean, the other area slightly different was just the question of welfare reform and how that's impacting on childcare. I mean, we had a briefing from SPICE, which was talking about changes that already happened 2011, reducing the maximum, I think 80% to 70%, and then potentially as we move into universal credit, there's going to be limits on how much I think the component can increase. I just wondered if people feel that's a major part of the problem with childcare, or if whatever.
I think we probably all want to come in on this one. I mean, the sort of the whole package of welfare reforms and all the various changes to benefits, as you know, have left women as the group who are going to be have the most impact as a result of them. And certainly with the work that we do with lone parents, we found that the change from 80% of costs being met to 70% has made work not pay for many of the parents that we're working with. So it's made childcare even less affordable than it was before for them. And all the new changes that were announced originally, and then some of the changes that have come in since then, I think have just created even a more confused picture for parents. They're actually finding it more difficult to work out now whether they can or can't afford childcare. So I think we need to start stripping, well, I mean, SPICE have done some analysis, but some of the latest analysis, which I think was in the paper yesterday, showed that the lowest income families were going to be worse off, many of them under the new changes to childcare funding. And for us in One Parent Family Scotland, sort of aligned to that is the concern that there's going to be increasing conditionality on lone parents as their youngest child turns 5 and they enter into sort of the mandated work activity. And the biggest issue that lone parents come up with to us with is childcare, and how they're going to be able to find the childcare that they can afford to be able to make work pay for them. And what we're finding anecdotally is that Job Centre Plus advisors are not acknowledging that as legitimate reason for them not to take up jobs that they're being asked to take up. So they're being threatened with them, and some are now beginning to be sanctioned and having their benefits taken away. So it's the knock-on effect as well of that childcare not being available, and what that's going to mean for families on low incomes, which is part of what we're starting to look at to see how we can make the case for more affordable childcare.
Maggie and then Claire. Claire Telfer, sorry.
From the sort of supply side, so to speak, from the childminder's perspective, it's equally difficult, because the 70% has meant that what they're finding, of course, is that more people are just defaulting on their payment. They're just, even though that you'd think that the childcare would be the top of the list, it clearly can't be. And as a result, what you've got is the people providing the childcare side looking about who's actually coming across the door, if they are actually in receipt of that type of welfare, can they actually take the risk to take that person on? And combined with that, the flexibility is fine, but the flexibility they're being asked to provide is the bit that says, I want 16 hours of childcare, but I've no idea when it's going to be. Now, that's impossible for them to work within the sort of ratios or to give a quality service. It makes it a very difficult relationship between both parent and childcare provider.
Claire.
I just wanted to endorse what that was saying as well around, I think one of the challenges we have around the cost of childcare, we know that's a huge barrier, particularly for mothers living on lower incomes. And some of the work we've done with parents found that not only are parents not able to take up work opportunities, but they're actually giving up work because of difficulties with childcare. Now, sometimes that's to do with the cost, sometimes that's to do with availability, but these are mothers who have been in employment but have had to give up those employment opportunities because of a lack of childcare, which is compounding the problem. And our concern around that would be the impact that's going to have on increasing levels of child poverty over the next few years, which we know is going to be a big concern. And then obviously with the impact that will have on outcomes and well-being of children and mothers as well. So we need to look at ways that we can better support that supply and costs of childcare within the Scottish context, I think.
Irene.
The whole impact of the universal credits and the changes, we're really worried about the effect of that actually on the supply of out-of-school care, because that's one of the few ways it's subsidised financially. It's subsidised in other ways with free Equal-Opps and so on. So we're worried about that impact long term, that we're going to reduce the supply of out-of-school care, and then if there is any kind of economic upturn and people are looking for more childcare, it's not going to be there. And out-of-school care, a lot of the places that are there now are the result of an investment of about £30 million 10 years ago. Now, that kind of money is not around anymore, so we really need to do something to retain the services we have. And again, we've just hearing from services and parents that parents, because they can't afford, even with the 10% cut from last year, they're reducing the hours they're using the services, and maybe using granny or auntie for another evening. And that's reducing the income for the services, who have to be sustainable. And in small rural services especially, if you lose just 2 or 3 families, your service is going to go under. So it really will have a major impact.
Do any of the other witnesses want to comment on that? Maggie.
I would have to say, of course, that is exactly the same in childminding, and the surveys that we're doing showing there's a lot more part-time places being looked for, which makes it increasingly difficult for that service to be viable. And bear in mind as well, a lot of those people will probably be lone parents in receipt of welfare benefits. So it's a kind of it's a vicious circle.
John, was there anything else you wanted to cover? No, okay. Can I move now to John Finney on questions around childminding, and then Dennis Robertson, who's going to ask questions on regulation.
Thank you, Convener. It's to yourself initially, Maggie, and thank you very much for the evidence. You've touched on some of the aspects. I particularly noted the statistics from 2011 and the contrast between remote towns and urban areas and the level of childminding. And it's to try and get on the record an understanding of the role of childminding. You refer to them as increasingly complex businesses, and you touched on the defaulting and payments there. Also, you mentioned the extension of public liability insurance to cover looking after the child in their own home. Are there any plans for your organisation members to expand? Because I presume, given the nature of the work, that there's an optimum number of hours that it would be safe to operate anyway.
Interesting. Of course, individually, childminders are self-employed, so effectively they can pick and choose what hours they can work, and that's going to be partly determined by what they feel able to do, but also partly determined by regulation, because they've got to evidence the fact they're providing a good quality service. So quite rightly, they're restricted by the ratios, the numbers of children they can look after at any one time. But in terms of number of hours, that's not defined. It's just more about what they're actually sensibly doing. They've got to combine that, after all, with their own family responsibilities in many cases. But it's more about the demand side of what's actually being asked for. But increasingly that is being asked for at different times of the day. So whereas at one time you might have been looking for mostly sort of daytime services, increasingly, of course, quite rightly, they're being asked to provide services in the evening or even at the weekends. So they've got to mix and match between their own responsibilities and what they're being asked to provide as a business, and then together with that, what they can actually show is good quality, because that's, after all, what they're providing for the regulator. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And accepting the difference, urban-rural, is there a particular type of client that you attract that other providers don't attract?
I think the flexibility obviously is easier in some ways for them to provide because they're not having to have a building with staff and all the overheads that go along with that. They're providing that service in their own home. So they can actually combine their work together with their family responsibilities. So if you're asking to provide a service on a Saturday morning, the fact that I've got my own family there as well is fine. I just take that child along and they become part of what's going on during that day as well. So it does mean that in terms of what parents are often looking for, it's easier for the childminder to provide the sort of flexibility. And that's the key thing.
Thank you. If I may broaden out to yes.
Stop you there, John, because Margaret Ann wanted to come in on that specific point, and then I'll come back to you if that's
I would
okay.
just like to make a comment on the regulation of childminding hours. And I think what I see, and especially from my post as a CEO of a company, I have to work a lot of hours that are outside normal working hours. And I see a real need for coverage in evening times, early mornings and weekends to cover. And I think that for us, there should actually be a real service there from childminders to be able to set up to do that. So I think regulation of hours will really restrict many jobs, and I think there's actually a lack of it being there, so a restriction would really curtail my job and make things very difficult for me for travel and international travel and evening and weekend types of work.
Thanks for that. Yes, certainly, ma'am.
Back on that, because I may be confusing that. It's not that the regulator would stop the person from working flexible hours. It's simply that they will need to make sure that what they're doing is evidence that they're actually providing a good quality service. So, and that's a slightly different thing. So and you would be asking that as a parent as well, that the person isn't just ignoring your child, but is actually providing a service for them. So it's more that rather than that there's no restriction in terms of hours for the regulator.
John.
It's a question for all our witnesses, please, and it is about the supply and demand. We have a recurring theme, and I'm sure we won't be too surprised what we hear today. I'd like to understand from each of the witnesses how we see the role of the state in this, because there are a range of providers, clearly, what should be done, and clearly, if there's you purport there should be a role for the state, and there's funding issues, and would you support a call for increased taxation to pay specifically for that? Would your organisations do that?
Start on that. Children in Scotland obviously has a long record of a particular perspective, and I think firstly, in terms of the strengths of the Scottish system, what we have, and increasingly we have across the political spectrum, a view, a strong view, and obviously you're part of this, that childcare, and we're all delighted that you're looking beyond the early years into school-age children. Childcare is an important, crucial part of our economic infrastructure, and if we are going to support particularly women to become increasingly skilled in a high-value economy, then childcare has to be an important part of our economic policies. And equally, it's clear across the spectrum again politically that you view childcare as an important social justice issue, particularly around narrowing the inequity gap and the value that out-of-school care and important early years is crucial for improving any child's chances. So that's fantastic that we've got that. And I don't think we have that sort of settled political view in other parts of the UK. So it's a huge strength and asset for us. So then, when we look at those, I think, those political crucial planks, if you then look at how we're investing in our infrastructure through childcare and our social justice policies, you have £8 billion at least pounds at a UK level being spent on a combination of subsidies, tax breaks, etc., for parents. So that works pretty well for those parents who can afford childcare, where the childcare is available and flexible enough to meet their needs and is good enough quality. So in a Scottish context, you have a pretty small subsection of parents who benefit from the current market forces of providing subsidies to parents to then go and identify in the market where there is suitable childcare from birth through to, let's say, adolescence. and it's just not working. So the alternative, we believe, and we've jointly submitted something to you, is that incredibly welcome investment is happening. I think it's 80 million has been identified for the extension of to 600 hours, for example. So really welcome. But when you place the 80 million in a system which is subsidising parents within Scotland at around £1 billion, we're really tinkering, and we have to ask, is this current way of subsidising childcare and after-school care, is it really fit for purpose if it's going to meet our aspirations? And we would say no. And I think collectively what we're saying, certainly Children in Scotland's membership, I think would say consistently, we have to at least have as a vision moving towards a system where we begin to look at subsidising the supply side. And we think the benefits of that are because that goes so well with the grain and the way in which we do business in Scotland. We have community planning partnerships. Obviously, they're being refreshed, but nevertheless, that's the way in which Scotland wants to look at its local services planning and delivery. We have a plurality of providers. Universal services have a crucial role, but we have a range of other providers within a good regulatory system. So we have all the levers in place, potentially, for delivering, as the First Minister said, a transformational childcare system. But we don't have the appropriate ways of subsidising this. So, sorry, to finalise, you asked about whether or not we should increase taxes. I think it would be really important for us to look at how we're currently using the very significant subsidy that we already have in a far more efficient way. I don't know if there would be gaps. Pardon?
How would you make the efficiencies?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that if we're already spending at a UK level £8 billion on a system that is working for a very small proportion of parents, then if we looked at actually providing through supply, through at a local level, transferring the subsidies from parents into local system, into the Scottish system, for example, that's used that money to invest locally, which is broadly a model that's used in other countries, but it would obviously need to fit for purpose in Scottish context. Using that, probably about £1 billion, which is Scotland's share of the UK level, what could we do with that? I think we could develop a far better system.
Sadwa, and I'll bring you in, Dennis. Okay.
Sorry, I just want to come in to endorse everything that Jackie has said. And there was a submission we put in collectively which looked at some of these issues and made these points. But I think currently where we are is that we've got a mixed market, as Jackie was saying. We've got the private sector, public sector, voluntary sector. We've got self-employed. We ourselves are a charity that runs flexible childcare. So in terms of where we are now, if we were to look at a short-term role for the state, we'd need to look to see how we manage that market better and more effectively. Because I think what Jackie's outlined is where we want to be, but it will take time to get there. But in the meantime, we need to have some mapping of services to see how are they distributed across the country. Are they meeting the need of parents? And there's also, there is a policy disjoint because we have the demand side subsidy through parents, which is a reserved matter, and we have the responsibility for childcare, which is a devolved matter. But I think we just need to, in the short term, look to see how we match those up more and align any subsidies or fees that we can and make recommendations for fee levels which would make best use of the subsidies as they currently exist. We do a lot of work with parents to support them with the take-up of what they're entitled to. Many parents don't take up all what they're entitled to. So there's that information role with parents that we need to do as well. But I think the beauty of having the supply side method is that it also stops this sort of divides that there are between childcare, how parents who work afford childcare, and then how parents who are training or in education try to afford childcare, because there are local subsidies there or institution-specific subsidies that parents can get. And actually it's about putting all that together and seeing what we can make out of the whole investment, which would lead to a more efficient and hopefully more accessible and affordable system.
Claire Simpson, just before I bring you in, Dennis Robertson, you have a supplementary?
Just on this point, the Scottish Government are asking the Council of Economic Advisers to look at the whole aspect of childcare and obviously the best way forward. Now, given that the Council are going to be looking at this, what specifically would you want them to, in terms of an outcome? So basically you have this blank sheet of paper to sort of go back to the Council of Economic Advisers and say, well, actually the outcome we're looking for is, what would you be looking for?
I think if I can start off, in our collective submission, we did ask whether, and to be honest, a group like us could meet with the Council, because we're very concerned that the economic case, and I'm sure it will be an excellent one that will be put in place, it does need to be informed by what we feel is right in Scotland for the quality of childcare on our children. So you only have to look at the current debate in England, where they're looking at raising the ratio of children to staff. In return, the UK government would say for requiring higher standards of training, of qualifications for the professionals. But clearly that's raised a lot of concerns. And certainly I think we're all clear that would not work in a Scottish context. But what we would like to do is to help the Council of Economic Advisers make sure that they're seeing some of their recommendations through that prism of what we think is best in quality. And then, of course, we need to open it up and debate and look at the balance. So I think what would be great is if the recommendation is if the Council of Economic Advisers report really helps with the jigsaw that Satvat was saying, is how could we get from our current position to over a longer term have the full economic drivers available to us to have a far more planned approach to childcare at a local level.
Claire Simpson, did you want to come in?
I wanted to endorse what Jackie and Satvat had said about supply and demand. And to make the point, I think that childcare, I mean, here we are, we're at an Equal Opportunities Committee talking about women in work. And very often it is seen, childcare is seen as a women's responsibility. And in fact, I think, you know, we have to widen it out and say it's more than that. It's a whole family's responsibility. But beyond that, I actually think it's society's responsibility. Because, you know, all too often, and when you read articles in newspapers about childcare, and if you trawl down to the comments, there are questions about why we should be paying for childcare. The reasons that we should be paying for childcare, there's obviously social justice, and there's that kind of argument about being out of poverty, but there is a strong case to be made for it benefiting the whole of society and economic regeneration, businesses, etc. And I think that that's a case we have to make. Also, just to say, I thought it was really telling. The previous government, the Labour government in Westminster, put quite a lot of money into childcare and particularly into the tax credit system. And earlier this year, Beverly Hughes, who was at that point, who was in that government, the Minister for Children and Young People, came out and said, hands up, actually, we got it wrong. Although we put that money in, we didn't put it in where we should have done. We should have put it into supply rather than demand, and that would have been a more effective way of, you know, regenerating the economy and actually getting that social justice and poverty solution too.
Thanks for that. Claire Telford, and then I'll bring in Sarah.
Again, I'd just like to endorse what's been said already in terms of supply-side funding, and I think the work of the Council of Economic Advisers will be really interesting in making the economic case around that. What I'd just like to add is that's not the only bit of work going on around childcare across the Scottish Government. So you've got the Early Years Task Force, for example, who is a subgroup that's looking at childcare. There's the Women and Employment Strategic Group following from the Women's Employment Summit, and I think we need to look at how we bring all those different elements together so that we're looking at this holistically, both the economic case and how we ensure that the quality is built into that system that we want to see so that outcomes for children improve. So I think there's some coordination across government, and also looking at the different policy agendas and outcomes through the child poverty strategy, the early years framework, our economic strategy. Childcare is a cross-cutting issue that pools can help us to achieve a lot of those outcomes. So that kind of coordinated approach, I think, is really important. I think from the Council of Economic Advisors work, we'd also like to see, we're going to have to look at the system that we would like to see and how much that might cost and what the state's role is in funding that, but also how we look at how much of that cost is transferred to parents. So particularly from the perspective of parents living on low incomes, we already know that the cost and access to childcare is a big issue for them accessing work. So what can we do, and what is the state's role in supporting the reduction of that cost to parents? So looking at learning from other systems, for example the Danish model and other Nordic countries where they have caps on fees with sliding scales so that those on lower incomes pay less. So I think it would be really useful if the Council of Economic Advisors, along with other parts of government working on this, were able to look at that to some extent as well.
Sarah.
I just wanted to say I think it's incredibly encouraging that your committee is looking at childcare as part of the infrastructure, because one of the problems we have with childcare is it has become to be seen as a private concern. And so I think 2 points. One is just to pick up on Claire Simpson's point about the need for people to understand that childcare is not just a women's issue, it's a family issue. And going back to the original question, which was about what is the role of the state, I think there really is a role for government in particular to start putting out messages that remind couple families in particular that childcare is an investment in their future, and that they should be thinking about both their salaries, not just the woman's salary, because that is what forces women out of the workplace, because she decides it's not worthwhile going back to work because the cost of childcare is just put against her own wages. So I think some very strong messages from our political leaders to say childcare is something that is, for men and women, it's an investment in the family's future would be very helpful. I also wanted to pick up on the planning issue and think about employers as well. Because I think there is a real issue here that employers now expect people, employees, parents, to work atypical hours. They want them in the evenings, they want them at weekends, they want them when childcare is not there for the children. And so working families would like to see the planning, particularly of large developments, to include the consideration of likely childcare demand by the employees of the employers who are going to be in those developments. So, for example, it might be possible to look at perhaps the developer putting in facilities for childcare, and I don't just mean the under fives. It would be great to have drop-in centres for teenagers, places where teenagers can come after school when mum or dad is still at work. They can do their homework, or they can just hang out and chill. And then I think we should also be looking at the employers. Why don't we set up a system whereby we're asking employers to subsidise the childcare of their employees? Because frankly, at the moment, employers are paying low wages to women and men who they're asking to work long hours outside of school hours. And really, I think they ought to be bearing some element of the cost of providing the infrastructure that makes their businesses function and UK and Scottish business successful.
Okay, thanks for that. Does anyone else want to come in on that point? No, can I bring in John Mason then with a supplementary?
It was to follow up, not particularly to Sarah, I think, but if I understand it correctly, One Parent Family Scotland do actually run flexible childcare, is that correct? And it said that in your paper, and it said such flexible childcare is not cheap to deliver. I just wondered if you could give us any indication of the kind of things we just heard. You know, how much more does it cost to have childcare, evenings, weekends, that kind of thing, than just normal?
It's like many of these things, it can cost as little or as much as you want it to, but because we have a system whereby we have support and we want to provide a certain quality of service, at full cost recovery we'd be charging £15 an hour.
in the past, and also still in certain parts of Scotland, like for example in some of the more rural areas like Aberdeenshire, we do have investment from the local authority coming into that flexible childcare because they see it as being particularly useful for those who are having to work flexible or atypical hours in areas which are rural, where it's easier for the childcare worker to be at home with your children in the evening than for you to have to take your child to a centre or somewhere else, so the child can have their evening routines or their morning routines maintained and be able to maintain their links with their friends and their community. But it is expensive to deliver because of its flexibility, and also because of having to, in rural areas, having to factor in some of the distances that we have to travel, etc. So like I said, at full cost recovery currently it's £15 an hour, but that can be for up to 3 children in a family. And that's why you can see 70% of that still leaves quite a gap for the parent to have to find to cover it if you're on a low income. But we'd set the service up particularly to complement childcare that was already there and to try to wrap around what traditionally had been the 8 till 6 childcare day, so the service can run from 6:30 in the morning till 10:30 in the evening.
Great, that's helpful, thanks.
Siobhan, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, just to expand on the childcare at home services that you do provide, it was just really to see how they operate, and do you use other partners to deliver that, and is it on consultation with parents and, you know, and what they need, and how could we use a similar system across Scotland to make sure that every family benefits
from that? Well, I think some of what Maggie's spoken about in the way childminders are developing their services is one way of looking to see how you increase flexibility. I mean, the thing with the childcare service that we've set up is you only pay for what you use, which again leads to maybe a higher unit cost when you're using it, but there's no retainer or anything like that. We did have support from quite a few local authorities in the past, but given that we're not a statutory service or a statutory requirement, and we fall between the sort of early years agenda and the economic development agenda, we've seen that investment begin to fall away in quite a few areas. And actually what's made us be able to provide a more affordable service to families in the past has been if there's been that investment, which means we can take the administration costs out of what we're charging families for. But no, we recruit, we have contracted workers, we provide training and support for them. We have managers and assistant managers who will go in and consult with the family, risk assess, look at all the sort of quality indicators that you would expect from any childcare providers, and then put together the package of support. We also offer, as far as possible, consistency in terms of the childcare workers. And we've got some childcare workers who've been with the same families for a number of years, particularly where there are children or young people who've got additional needs or disabilities. That's an area where we find the service works really well, because we then provide those workers with the specialist training they need to be able to support the child who's got the additional needs. And I think it should be part of the infrastructure of childcare that's available. So some of what Margaret and what you were talking about earlier about the weekend working, the evening working, you know there's a service there that you can rely on that will come into your own home and be with your children.
No, I absolutely do see a need for that. I mean, I'm surrounded by colleagues who have trained, you know, for 10, 12 years, gone through degrees, masters, PhDs, and they're absolutely struggling to maintain their careers because of childcare, especially in a working in science where you're running experimental protocols that will run over weekends and evenings, and there's no support there available. And I see a lot of loss of females in that stage of their careers, and it's a real loss from all our skills and all the training that's going ahead. And I do think that there is a responsibility for an employer to actually ensure that perhaps there is something in place, some support mechanism in order to ensure that we can keep women in jobs such as, like in the University of Glasgow, we have one nursery facility which only has 75 places for the whole of the university, which also opens up that other people outside the university can use that facility. Now, we're building a lot of new buildings, putting a lot of money into research within the university, but are we in that process actually ensuring that there's some support in childcare in order to help women to sustain these careers and not watch them having to run out the door in a panic to collect their children at the end of the day? And I don't see that happening.
Thanks for that. Can I ask a specific question initially to Maggie and Irene, and it's about the take-up of childminding and out-of-school care services in rural areas. Is there a higher percentage, or are there a higher percentage of women use childminding and out-of-school in rural areas than cities?
I would say yes. The way that childminding works as opposed to an out-of-school care, a group service, is that just because of the actual demand in a rural area, it's not often viable to have a group service, whereas it is viable for an individual childminder to be providing the whole sort of range of services from the sort of 0 to whatever age the parent wants it. So it's more a question of viability than it is about whether or not the other service could actually operate. It would need to be heavily subsidised.
Irene?
Yes, sometimes some of the smaller out-of-school care services, actually, when the numbers go down, the individuals go up and become childminders because they already know the children and they already know the families. And then the other way round, it might be a group of childminders who get together to set up a group service once the numbers go up again. The childcare sector is quite interchangeable. We have people working across different parts of it. But certainly, in my experience in talking to small rural services, I've talked to childminders who have an assistant, and they actually have, if you like, a mini group service with the maximum number of children that you can have. And I think they usually mix the care of younger children with older children, and so it's a bit like a family, an extended family. So obviously we would support that as a more economically viable option also for providing childcare in rural areas.
I think, Convener,
Jackie, yes.
Could I add that, but unfortunately we can't answer your question precisely because we don't have the evidence. So again, collectively, we're looking to changes in the Children and Young People Bill that's just been published to, one of the things that we'll be asking for is to require local authorities, community planning partnerships, to have information on the provision of childcare, including out-of-school care provision. Because, yes, we can't answer your question, but without that information, we also can't answer quite a lot of the questions that you're saying precisely in terms of, well, what would work? And that's also important because in terms of the nature of Scotland, we have such a diversity in terms of our geography, rurality, etc., and also commitment to looking at solutions which fit Fife as opposed to Glasgow. But without that information, then how we're going to cost that, how we're going to think about what's right for those children and families, we're really sort of bedeviled by a lack of proper evidence and information.
Thanks for that. Maggie, did you want to come back in?
Sort of reinforce what Irene was saying. We do have very good examples of extended childminding services, and again the regulations allow that. That's fine for somebody who's working as a childminder to take on an assistant, and if they are able again to demonstrate quality, that they can actually extend that service, and that's often a very good solution for a rural area that may not be able to sustain an out-of-school care group. It may also be that that's parental preference, that they would actually prefer the child to be in that setting for whatever reason. And it may also then combine with, even with some of the services that Zat was saying. I think you'll find that you'll probably have childminders who are actually part of that service too, providing that flexibility, which allows them viability in terms of what they're doing if they're providing a very part-time childminding service. It really is an incredibly complex setup, but it works in the sense that what you've got to start off with thinking is about what parents need and what's going to provide good outcomes for children.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move on now to Dennis Robertson and questions around regulation, and then Marco Biaggi has questions about the Children and Young People's Bill. Dennis.
Thank you, Convener. We've touched briefly on some of the aspects around regulation. I think everyone would probably agree that regulation is necessary for a variety of reasons. But would you see regulation perhaps as being a barrier in some respects? And is that then putting people into a position that they're looking for an alternative to childcare in a much more informal aspect, sometimes with maybe other relatives, neighbours, or maybe people who used to childmind but have come out because of regulation but are doing it on an informal basis?
I'm conscious that Sarah is leaving us at 10:30, so can I come to Sarah first if she has any comments on that, or if there's anything else that you would like to mention that you've not, if you could perhaps do so now, and then I'll move on to the other witnesses.
I think to wrap up, simply to say that it's really important to look at childcare as being more than early years. It's different from early years, which is education, and childcare is from birth right through to when a young person is ready to stand on their own 2 feet and no longer need parental oversight. And I think one of the problems with the UK childcare debate is that it focuses on the under fives far too much. We're seeing that with the vouchers that the UK government are proposing to bring in to replace the existing ones. They're limited to children up to 5. Eventually it's going to go up to age 12, but that really does leave a big gap for teenagers. I think it's also a critical area to think about is support for maternity returners, because that's when childcare is at its most expensive. It's when women are most likely to drop out of the jobs market because they can't see how they can square the circle in their family incomes. I haven't got any easy answers on that. There's definitely a combination to be looked at of childcare provision and employment and flexible working and planning across the piece. So I think those are basically the 3 things I think we should be looking at. We need to look at maternity returners, we need to look at older children, after school care, and the additional costs for children with disabilities as well. We do a lot of work with families who have disabled children. We know how many of those parents give up work because they cannot afford the cost of childcare. It's on average 3 times as much to raise a disabled child as a child without a disability. So I'm afraid it's a big complex set of issues that your committee is looking at. I commend the work that you're doing. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking us to give evidence today, and anything we can do to submit more evidence or exemplars of good employment practice, we'll be very happy to contribute.
Thanks very much for that, Sarah, and thank you for joining us this morning. Can I move now to Irene?
In terms of regulation and quality, we completely support that, and one of the patterns we find in different research in Scotland is that parents, where they can, often will choose kinship care, grandmothers, aunties, close friends, before childcare. And that's not always to do with cost and quality issues, that's to do with trust and family relationships. But where it really affects families is where their family members can't help them with childcare in that way. But if you ask parents out there what their first choice would be, and all the research, they still want someone close to them to provide that care. What's the other part of the question, sorry?
Basically, it was whether or not some of the regulations put in barriers, and people are opting, to look at much more informal aspects of childcare. So it's just whether or not regulation is necessary. Yes, I think it is, but it's whether or not it in itself has created some barriers and is moving people towards looking at much more informal aspects, not just through maybe kinship care, but looking for maybe people who perhaps used to childmind who have come out because of the regulation, but are maybe still imposing charge, but maybe at a less cost.
Sure, that is the case, that happens. I mean, I know it's the case. The concern, of course, is that quite often what you find is that the ratios go up. So you've got more children there, and there's no judge about the quality other than, I know you could argue the fact that the parent ought to be able to decide as to whether the quality is okay, but then that kind of goes in against what's already happening in terms of regulation. And there's been good evidence to show that actually the quality of childminding services since the annual inspections have been brought in for new childminders, that has improved. Now, there's no doubt that if you look at the grading system, that childminders are doing extremely well. But take that out from the regulatory system and you end up with all sorts of concerns, especially if that person's being paid to provide childcare, and especially if that payment is coming from an employer or from the state. That means effectively what you're doing is subsidising unregulated childcare. You could end up with real problems with that. And you would, I think if I was also providing a regulated childminding service, I would seriously consider why on earth would I do that if I cannot work outside of the regulatory system and operate legally, which currently they can't. The bit about kinship care is also interesting, and Irene's absolutely right. A lot of people will opt for family members to provide childcare, and that is certainly about elements of trust, but it's also undoubtedly about elements of cost. And whilst I love the fact that you've got people out there enjoying their grandchildren, I also worry deeply about those grandparents who are struggling to provide that childcare and doing it because they feel they have to. I don't know where the sort of balance is, but I would like the balance to be that it's about parental preference and about outcomes for children and not about the economy side of it.
There's a great deal of stress then on families, and perhaps there's, in some respects, grandparents or other relatives feel there's an obligation to do something, which is probably, could be to preventing them from perhaps going out and earning an income for themselves.
I mean, you'll get childminders who are providing a service for their relatives as well, and that's fine. That's the job they've chosen to do, and I think that's an extremely good combination. And as I say, where it works well, it works really well. But as I say, there are concerns for me about the fact that parents are often maybe forced into that, and that relatives or friends feel an obligation to help.
Claire Simpson and then Claire Telfer.
Okay, I wanted to come in on that point about grandparents. I would reiterate what Maggie said there and just say that in Scotland we have one of the highest, the highest rate in the UK of grandparents providing childcare. And I think from memory, from the Growing Up in Scotland data, it's about 66%, which is incredibly high. And I think, yes, where it's through choice, and whose choice is that? And I think there's a huge element where it's about care. And I think, thinking about it from a policy level, when you look at, people talk now about the sandwich generation, the people who are looking at elderly parents on the one hand and grandchildren on the other. And I think that's, a real stress for people. I think sometimes people do feel that obligation. And also, I think everyone's aware of the fact that people, particularly of my generation, are going to have to work until we drop. So I can't see myself being able to do that childcare for my grandchildren if and when they come. But I think, it's not a sustainable option, and we have to look at the realities of how we provide childcare that really is about choice for parents.
Claire.
I just wanted to add that I think it's a particular issue for families living on lower incomes as well. From last year, we spoke to over 100 parents across Scotland about their childcare issues and challenges, and one of the key messages that came through from that was around the informal care that was being used, and I think that's the proportion's probably slightly higher for those on lower incomes. And for some parents that was about choice in terms of they wanted somebody that they knew the family and that trust element in terms of who was caring for their children. But for most parents it wasn't choice, it was about because they couldn't afford the other childcare that was available, or there was a lack of services. And what came through, and actually a lot of the people we spoke to were grandparents who were giving up work or going to work part-time so that they could take on the caring responsibilities for their grandchildren. So I think we do need to look at how we can support in a more sustainable way families, because we're almost compounding that issue of keeping families living on lower incomes if we're looking at that informal nature of care.
I believe there's an increase in young carers looking after their siblings. in terms of that's a sort of, you know, in terms of it's a choice because of the costs of childcare. So young carers, maybe the age of 14, sometimes younger, are looking after their siblings after school.
Satwant, did you want to come in?
Just very briefly to say that lone parents as a group rely heavily on informal childcare, and of those using childcare, 46% have said it was informal. And that's either for the child's grandparents or trying to make some sort of arrangement with the ex-partner, which of course can cause problems at times. And that was mainly because working lone parents paying for childcare are much more likely than couples paying for childcare to find it difficult to meet the childcare costs. So for them it was purely about, well, there's some choice, but a lot of the thing is cost. And I wonder, when we're looking at what type of childcare we want in Scotland, if we look at the infrastructure of childcare and having those local neighbourhood centres or whatever, which would provide a range of services and be universally available, if that choice is there, whether then we'd have so many choosing to use family members or not, if they saw that there was a viable alternative there that they could afford. And the question regarding regulation, I would argue that regulation is important if it can show that we're doing the best to improve and maintain the best outcomes for children and young people. And that would very much be the view of OPFS, that we would support regulation in the same way as we support regulation and inspection for schools and school-age children. If we want this to be part of our service infrastructure, we need to ensure that it's good quality.
Does anyone else want to come in on the question? Maggie?
Just one thing about the kind of outcomes for children. It's very easy in this debate to not forget that, but to almost put it to one side. I mean, all the evidence is showing you that the quality of care for those very young children, and that goes on to school-age children, is really important. And it shouldn't be the case that it's just about whether I can afford to pay as to whether my child is going to benefit. And as you've heard from the other people, that it's those low-income parents that are maybe providing that sort of kinship, looking for kinship care, which may or may not be okay, and they're looking for, and the bit about it's not that they don't want the best for their children, they absolutely do, but they are restricted by what they can afford. And certainly with childminding services, you're not looking for something that's an informal just for a one-off. You're looking for a long service that you're actually going to be integrating together with the family. And that can go on up until those children become adults. You'll often find that relationship continues, and that's what we should be looking for, which kind of combines with what you want with strong communities and what Satwa was talking about. So it would be an urge to look at the children as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point that's been made about the increase in grandparents looking after children. And I'm sure we all know people who have either reduced or given up work to look after grandchildren. And this is not the inquiry to do it, but it would be interesting long term to look at the impact on pensioner poverty of grandparents being put in a position where they feel they have to either reduce their hours or leave work to care for grandchildren. Can I move now to Marco Biagi with questions around the Children and Young People's Bill, and then Siobhan McMahon has questions around barriers and statutory rights. Marco.
Thank you. The Children and Young People Bill proposes to increase the provision of early years education from 475 to 600 hours, as I'm sure you're aware. How do you think this will help?
Who'd like to kick off?
Yes. If I can, on behalf of our members and the response, obviously we were gathering the responses. There is overall a very strong welcoming from, I think, membership represented here, that the First Minister has made a significant commitment to childcare, initially with 600 hours. Now we've seen that there's a substantial amount of investment going into that, and then very clearly at the last party conference saying he wants his long-term vision is transformation, and you're seeing that being echoed by the other political parties. So that's great. In terms of the contribution that the 600 hours will make to that long-term vision, the views of our membership is it's rather lukewarm. And that's partly, I think, because well, really the discussion that we've talked about here, with all due respect, it's a substantial amount of investment that's going in to increase from 475 to 600 hours. But it really is a very small amount of money if you look at the totality of the billions that is being spent. And our members, I think, many would certainly say that they could have thought of better ways of improving children's outcomes with the 80 million contribution, than moving from 475 to 600 hours. Such as one thing is greater priority for vulnerable children at a younger age is a very strong demand, looking perhaps at the additional needs of children with disabilities, a greater take on the needs of the socio-deprived, rather than a universal offer. But on the other hand, other members feel quite strongly that a universal offer is the only way forward. You can't target. It's inappropriate to do that. So there's it's caused a lot of discussion and concern. But nevertheless, overall, let's move to that. That's great. It's going to be 15 hours extra a week. No, that's not quite a month. So it's, but nevertheless, that will be welcome. It will be high quality. But it's seen as a small step, I think. Is that?
I'm seeing heads nodding at different points of that, so clearly there's a diversity of views. Good.
Maggie, and then Satwat, and then Claire Telford and Claire Simpson. Everybody.
I suppose that it's, if I'm looking from a child-minded perspective from what our members are saying, if the 600 hours is simply an extension of what the existing provision of local authority nursery, then they're concerned, actually, because they're going to lose work out of it. And where you've got businesses that are not as viable as they would like to be, then they're going to find that they're actually losing business as a result. Of course, what government is actually looking for is flexibility with that 600 hours, and they're now talking about early learning and childcare and not just about preschool education. But the debate, of course, is still going on as to how that's actually going to be provided in practice. And we are part of the sort of, the early years, the sort of task group, subgroup that's looking specifically at that. So, we are included in that discussion, and that's good. But I still worry about how it's actually going to be delivered in practice, as to whether, in fact, that investment is going to really improve things, either for children or for working parents. But at its best, then certainly, of course, it's moving towards a more universal supported childcare system that we would like. But I don't think they're looking for childcare as a result of that 600 hours.
Satwat, and then Claire Telford.
I think Maggie's covered some of the points I wanted to talk about. I mean, we're one of the members of Children in Scotland who advocate universal services. So in that way, we welcome the increase and the flexibility. I think it's a first step, and it's one of many that we need to take in order to have the childcare infrastructure we've been talking about. And within any universal service, we'd like to see a greater investment and targeting of those who maybe are at the greatest risk of not achieving what they should do and having the poorest of outcomes. But I think what's happened here is that there's been some work done to try to match giving flexibility in order to allow parents to work and trying to increase the number of hours children have in preschool. And I'm not sure whether the infrastructure is there to be able to provide the flexibility and what's required for the children to achieve the outcomes. What we don't want to see is a system where a parent is told you can have flexibility, but that means you either have 8 till 1 or 1 till 6, which is what many providers will be grappling with, because if they're being asked to provide their hours more flexibly, it's going to increase their costs in terms of their staffing levels that they need to look at. So I think it's a complex area, but the sort of principle behind it of trying to balance a sort of parental employability and outcomes for children is the right principle to have, and is the one that we'd like to see being carried forward through this. I just am concerned that you're going to end up with families who are going to have to put together their own patchwork of how they're going to get that flexibility and to be able to make the most of those hours. So one of the things we'd said in our submission to the consultation on the bill was you actually needed to have in place the services, the brokerage services, to be able to enable parents to put together that offer in the way that best suited their child and themselves.
Okay. Claire Telfer.
I think Satvat has covered much of what I was going to add to that. Save the Children very much welcomes the additional hours as a step towards a more universal system. And I think in terms of the hours themselves and the balance between supporting children's outcomes, that's positive. The flexibility part, I think, is really one of the key elements around this, and is what could make the difference in relation to what the committee's looking at around women's work. A really strong message from parents that we spoke to last year around nursery hours was they wanted that to be delivered in a much more flexible way. So it did give them the opportunity to take up training, employment, and to work. And I think also, you know, the additional hours, while they may be incremental at this stage, will have a slight impact on cost for parents of children who have children of that age. So I think there's certainly steps in the right direction. And I think we've also talked about a longer term approach, which we kind of all endorse, where we'd like to see that shift become a bit more transformational and look at the state's role in that. And I know that, for example, the Danish model has national entitlements to childcare places for all parents, and whether that's something we might aspire to in the longer term, because that's certainly one of the elements of that model that has perhaps led to a more sustainable childcare system being put in place.
Just on that, in Denmark, the actual provision, does that come through municipal sources, state sources, private sources, some mix? I mean, does the balance of how it's provided change from here?
I'm not an expert, but my understanding on that is that most of that is funded through, I think the government in Denmark funds about a quarter of childcare places, and the rest of that is made up through local taxation. And then an element of that is also parental fees, which is capped at a certain level. But in terms of provision, my understanding is most is the state, but it is a mixture still.
Okay. It is mostly the state, but then they have a different system in terms of that they will often employ childminders rather than having them as self-employed. I suppose one of the good outcomes, I should say, from this is because of the current system where it's mostly local authority nursery or private nurseries that are providing the current number of hours. What they're now looking at is why not use childminding services, and how can you actually start to match across the outcomes that are shown through the current regulatory system to what's actually being the outcomes that are being provided by under the education system, because they would appear to be very similar. So why not match across and then allow more flexibility there and allow more sort of choice for parents?
I think it's just, if I could add as well, in terms of the context of the Children and Young People's Bill, but also echoing Claire's earlier point around the sort of the significant policy agendas that are engaged in aspects of this. The energising that's on the early years front in particular, that's come through partly from the bill, the political interest, but also initiatives, policy developments like the Early Years Collaborative, is, I think, leading to a lot of activity at national level, but crucially at local level. I think it's really, I think there have been concerns amongst us around previous incarnations, for example, childcare partnerships at local level, which sought to harness that plurality of provision. It's a mixed picture, but have certainly fallen into abeyance. And it's reviving, I think, that all the principles of working together across sectors, it's been given a real energy and boost by the Early Years Collaborative, and also the sort of flexibility provisions under the Children and Young People's Bill, which can only be welcome because they're taking a very good, welcome, holistic view of improving children's outcomes from pre-birth, certainly through to the early years. But I think, as we've been saying consistently, we'd like to see that approach and philosophy being taken through to look at childcare beyond the early years and into certainly well into adolescence.
I move now to Siobhan McMahon on statutory regulations and statutory rights and barriers.
Thank you. Really, it was just to get on record, because a number of you in your submissions have said childcare should be a statutory right. So really, should it be? And also, what would your description of that be? Because sometimes, you know, we talk about statutory rights for one thing, and others think of something else. So it would be helpful to know what you think of that.
Who would like to answer first?
I think in terms of, we could look at a variety of models. You've already heard about Denmark. You could also, but I think we would want to be looking at something that suits Scotland. I think we need to look at the current landscape in terms of a recognition, for example, within Curriculum for Excellence, that children from the age of 3 should be learning through play, obviously at that age, and expecting certain entitlement around their learning and their learning development. Then you also have the early years framework, which is looking at 0 to 8. But how that then meshes together with Curriculum for Excellence is where it's working well. There's some really exciting thinking about early care and education, but it's a bit of a mismatch. And similarly, in the way in which health thinks about how they're going to make sure that certain milestones within a child's health is developing well, there are particular milestones there. So I think it's important to look at the variety of good things happening in various chunks of a child's life in the early years, for example, but the concern, of course, that it's simply not cohering well enough. And would a statutory right and entitlement to a good quality care and learning experience help the child? You know, I think we'd have to discuss that and debate that further. But in terms of what a parent should have and be entitled to, I think, I mean, obviously others will be more expert at this, but I think it's essentially what parents are wanting and that right. The concern would be how would that then be met? Because I think what we've been discussing earlier on, it's not entirely settled. So I think we need to be very careful personally, and because we haven't discussed this fully with our members, but about what we want to put in statute before we have a real clarity around what we expect from children's outcomes from the state and various and its agencies, together with what we want, what we think parents, or what parents are saying they need from the state as a legal duty, as opposed to an expectation and that flexibility.
Sadhva.
I think in Scotland, originally parents had a right for their child to have an education from the 1945 Act, I think, and then the Schools Act came in and made it a right in the child's own right. I mean, Scotland was quite leading in that field. And I think there's something worth investigating, as Jackie said. I mean, I think we're not fully there yet, about whether the parent should have a right to childcare or whether the child should have a right to early years education. And I think, you know, a lot of the work that Save the Children particularly have done around the sort of educational gaps that emerge very, very early in a child's life that are to do with poverty and disadvantage and that are retained throughout their life, but that actually early years education has a major impact in narrowing that gap. So I think there's something that's really worth looking at there, but it really needs to be explored rather than, I mean, I feel that I couldn't give you a definitive answer, but I think it's certainly worth looking at. And I think, although I'm coming from a parenting organisation, we don't represent parents as such. What we look at is to try and represent good parenting, if you like. And so I would say from that point of view that probably, my personal opinion at this minute is that it would probably be more from a child's rights point of view than parents.
Satwa?
Thank you. I'm going to come at it totally differently because, I mean, I think what both the previous speakers have said is right. But I think if we're looking at what the reality is in terms of poverty, economic disadvantage, and what we've heard today and in the written evidence about the barrier that the cost and availability of childcare is, particularly for women to go into work and to sustain work, and for the client group we work with, for lone parents who have now got the spectre of, well, welfare reform is here for them. They're being impacted by it. And they're coming to us and saying childcare is one of the biggest barriers. The cost of it, the availability of it in being able to take up work or to be able to make work pay. And before I go on to the statutory bit, I just want to say, I've got a quote here from a lone parent in Glasgow who says, money factors in right at the end. In my head, I've got to get 16 hours to meet Job Centre Plus requirement. It's got to be local, it's got to be childcare, or it's got to fit around school hours. And then I look at the money. So actually she's not seeing if it's going to make her better off or support her family in any way. She's looking at all the conditions that are being placed on her. And, you know, we can take childcare out of that equation for her if there's, I mean, in terms of looking at childcare as a statutory service, it would be to ensure that there's some sort of duty to be able to provide it and to ensure that there's sufficient childcare available so that it doesn't stop someone like Linda from being able to go into work and provide for her family. But at the same time, she's confident in the quality of what her child is going to, and she knows that, you know, I mean, it's a sort of short-term and a long-term look in terms of a statutory framework for childcare. Short-term in terms of supporting the parental employability agenda, long-term in improving the outcomes and reducing some of those gaps which result out of disadvantage and poverty. So for me, it's about looking to see what sort of statutory framework we need to have, either at national or local level, which means when we're looking at a time of reduced financial investment in services, it's not the first thing to go.
Does anyone else want to come in on that point? Irene.
In terms of, you know, regulation for childcare provision, we would say it is about children's rights to access to play and care and learning services, and about parents' rights to be supported in bringing up their children by being able to access different kinds of services for different ages, stages and needs of their children. Every family and every child is unique. And we find in out-of-school care, for example, we're providing places for working parents, but we're also providing places for children who are vulnerable and in need of extra support. Now, I met some colleagues from another organisation at another event a couple of days ago, and she told me about a kinship carer, a grandmother who's 80, who's looking after 6-year-old twins because she's looking after her adult child as well. Now, I suggested to that organisation, try somewhere for us to get together and get a place in out-of-school care for these twins to give this grandmother a break. Now, in that community, there should be linked up services. I think we should link this to getting it right for every child. The Children and Young People Bill at least is very much bringing in children's rights. I think that's a very, very good thing, bringing in a children's rights approach, which we should build on. And the Early Years Collaborative, it sounds like there's a lot of exciting work going on out there, but that should build on to later years, to school-age children in need as well. There's going to be, we hope, a lot of discussion and debate about how this is done to bring childcare in as a right for parents and children and communities. So we hope our contributions here have helped something towards this.
Maggie, and then I'll come back to Jackie.
I would have to say agree with what Irene was saying, as well as the other two folks. I mean, I think it was that aspect of the range of services that's going to be important, because the sort of statutory right starts to become limiting, and that's always a worry. You don't want to reduce the types of services that are available, because you've got to look at what that child needs and how they're really going to benefit from having, you know, from being in that service at all. likewise with childminding services, they're increasingly being used to support vulnerable families and their children. And it's a really positive service, I think, because it does mean that you've actually got support there. It's a much more universal approach as well to where families are in need, because that's not just a sort of postcode area. That's about looking at families and looking at their needs rather than just at their income. So those sort of range of services have become really important, because if you don't have that, then it really does limit the options for some of those vulnerable families, and it also limits the options in terms of what's being a statutory provision. So,
Jackie.
And among our membership are local authorities and health boards, and the measure that Satvat was talking about in terms of discretionary versus statutory services being used inevitably as a way of deciding what will be cut from very hard-pressed local government budgets, for example. Joseph Rowntree Foundation produced a report 2 weeks ago into 5 local authorities where that is the measure to cut or not. It will be discretionary. The vast majority of services that we're all talking about are discretionary. And this is not a criticism of local authority. We are all working with very dedicated, gifted professionals who are seeing their services being decimated, or certainly in fear of that, inevitably being in the front line of cuts over the next few years. So in terms of looking at to create statutory rights or not, setting aside the financial cost of this is a way in which we can protect services, in which some services are protected, in a very crude way, of course. So I think we do need to recognise the pressures that our colleagues are under in local authorities, and be very concerned about the future for these services while they remain discretionary over the next few years.
Siobhan, do you have any further questions?
Not on that, but on the barriers.
Do you want to just cover that, and then I'll move to Marco?
Okay, thanks. That was very helpful, thank you. One of the things that came out of some briefings, working families and one-parent families, was the impact for disabled children and their families when getting the provision for childcare. We obviously heard earlier, the inadequate provision and the cost of provision is higher than any other family. So I was just wondering, what can child carers, the government, do to make provision better for disabled children and their families? And is there examples in Europe or elsewhere in the world that we can be looking at as models as we go on and look at evidence throughout the committee work?
Satvat.
I'll start off in answer to the first part of your question. I'm hoping other colleagues around the table will know more about what's going on in Europe and elsewhere. I think one of the interesting things here is when we talk about the costs, I think the Working Families witness spoke about it being 3 times as much for a disabled child. And the question I then had was, well, then who bears that cost? Because surely it's not right for the parent to bear that cost. And it should be looking at how we provide the state support or the subsidy to make that place accessible and that experience suitable for the disabled child. And certainly in a previous job where I worked in early years, we had a whole pilot project looking at access to childcare for disabled children and looking at the appropriate types of access to childcare for disabled children. Because we found, certainly within One Parent Family Scotland, higher numbers of lone parents either have a disability or are looking after a child with a disability. And we found that there was higher levels of unemployment, higher levels of poverty, but also underemployment. Where you had families where there might be a child with a disability, where the parent felt more comfortable working in a job which would be easier for them to walk away from, or where there might be more flexibility, even though it didn't in any way reflect their experience, their professional background, or a number of other things. So it is more expensive to provide for childcare. For disabled children, we quite often find in certain situations there are 2 members of staff who will go in to support a family where there's a child with a disability. But we would also be identifying where there are subsidies to be able to support that family, so the cost isn't being passed on to the family for that childcare. So I think when we're looking at looking at services for disabled children and childcare for children with disabilities or additional needs. It is recognising that there might be training needs which need to be paid for the staff. There might be adaptations, but it's about how we absorb that cost and not pass it on to the family, because we would certainly see it as, it may not be discrimination in legislation, but it feels morally wrong to be able to putting it in place for disabled families with disabled child is another barrier.
Mayor Simpson?
Secretary has said, you know, it may not be discrimination legally, and sometimes it may, sometimes it may not be, but sometimes it actually is, under the Equality Act and also under additional support for learning. And, you know, anecdotally, and I quote the case of a friend here who lives in a neighbouring local authority area and was trying to get her child into a play scheme over the summer holidays, and her child has a number of disabilities, and she's a very professional, articulate person who knows her rights, and she actually did take it up under the Additional Support for Learning Act, and, you know, got the support for her son to enable him to go into the summer school, you know, holiday thing, get one-to-one care. But I think that as well as what could be done in terms of actual provision, there are rights that could be used at the moment that are not being used, and perhaps that a number of providers are not aware of, and that there's more perhaps that Scottish Government could do to push and promote those rights.
Maggie?
I was just going to add that, I mean, there's certainly regularly cases where childminders are looking after children with additional support needs or disabled children, and it's the only problem, of course, is that there's a lack of consistency about that. They've got to work out as a sole provider as to whether they can actually provide the service, not just to that child, but also to maintain quality with the other children that they're looking after. So it often works extremely well, and ironically, they probably don't charge any more for it because it's just one child and it's providing, so long as it's just taking up one place. And it depends then on the individual childminder, as I say, and they should make that decision in that way as to whether they're capable of doing it. But it's the lack of consistency, so you won't be able to guarantee that service throughout Scotland, because that depends entirely on the individual childminder as to how they see, as to how they're able to actually provide the service.
Jackie?
I think since the last Children's Act, there has been improvement for disabled children as a result of the statutory entitlement under the Children in Need provisions, which has led to ensuring that local authorities, where they assess that a child is in need, often will do so where a child has a disability, and will then there will be a route to additional support. And I think the problem that a local authority will have in taking on that statutory entitlement is that they are also subject to the market and what is available. It's where it works well. It works well, but the availability may well hinder the full range of support that, even if the local authority could afford it and would like to do it, it simply might not be available. So I think you're seeing, and also, of course, in the application of the definition of a children in need, you inevitably have thresholds and definitions that are different at a different local authority level. So there's an awful lot out there to be proud of within Scotland, but unfortunately it's pretty mixed. I think another issue in terms of, if you like, our education system, obviously Claire's touched on the Additional Support for Learning Act, but I'd like to also point to a sort of cultural issue, if you like, around our schooling system, which is about our commitment in Scotland to inclusion. And I think, personally, as a parent, I feel my children have benefited from an approach which is very inclusive in our schools, to, you know, having a broad representation of our children's community, including those with additional support needs. But of course, the additional help that those schools can provide to make sure that their children can experience a mainstream education is also under threat in relation to classroom assistants, for example, and being able to afford the increased accessibility required to participate in after-school clubs. So, you know, I think the sense is that there's I would suggest that there's a lot that's positive, but we need to be very wary about the potential dangers of for additional support, children with additional support needs, because some of the cuts that are underway, inevitably.
Siobhan, did
you of any example in any other country that we could look at, or no, at the moment?
Sorry, Sam.
No, you go.
No.
I was just going to say, I don't necessarily know if it's a good example or a bad example, but I'll say it anyway. In my previous role in London, for a London local authority, and we were one of the pilots looking at ways of making childcare accessible for children with disabilities. And we actually got into a debate with the government at Westminster about what's the best way to do so. Because we argued again very strongly for a supply-side subsidy where you are actually making the places and the staff available by putting in the support for the supply side. And they were looking at an increase in the tax credit allowance for families where there was a child with a disability, which would allow providers to charge more for those places, which we argued that actually could be challenged under the DDA if you were being charged more for the same service. It never went to court, so we never know if that was the case or not. But certainly there were 10 pilots, and we all looked at different ways of supporting children with disabilities. And overwhelmingly, what came out of the evaluations of the overall project was that you need to look at a supply-side subsidy to make those places more accessible, but also ensure that the staff and the equipment, if they're required, are there. And it still gives the parent an element of choice then about being able to say, well, actually, I still want my child to go to my local community childminder or my local community nursery, and then it's the local authority's obligation to look at making that place accessible.
In terms of the European examples, firstly, I think it's really important to say that actually we have several visits a year from others in Europe who come to us for examples of good practice. And in relation to children with additional support needs, I think we're a world leader in terms of our progressive approaches, particularly around inclusion. And one thing particularly in the last couple of visits that we've organised is the increasing development of having on one campus the primary, secondary and special school, which that doesn't appear to be a common thing. So they're very excited by that. Where I think we fall down on, and they're quite surprised, is this ad hoc nature of provision. And they're very concerned that in one area, although obviously very strong regional approaches in many European countries, nevertheless, the different stories you'll hear depending on your geography in Scotland surprises them, and the lack of an overall strategic approach, whether it's at local or national level, appears to be something that surprises them, given how much good local practice there is.
And just finally, the Children in Scotland briefing, I was quite surprised that at one part where it said fathers are more likely to be employed than men without children. Is there reasons for that, and has research been done to explain that? And if it has been, could the committee get the links or whatever it may be to it?
I'll look at the sources for that and come back to you in terms of some of the detail.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Thanks.
Can I ask another specific question to Maggie and Irene? We've had a lot of evidence about occupational segregation and the lack of men in caring professions. So can I ask Maggie and Irene, how many men are childminders and how many men work in out-of-school care? And are you actively doing something to encourage men into the professions?
I'm sure you know the answer. There's there's a handful of men who are registered as childminders. However, there are a lot of men who are the partners of registered childminders who actually play an active part in the childminding service. So it's one of those sort of ones where they don't appear to be part of the service, but they certainly are. And also that they are actually, in many cases, and increasingly so, they are registered as assistants on the childminder certificate. So you'll get more dual childminding services being provided, and you'll also, as I say, get a lot of men as partners who also play an active part. And that's a really important part of the service because they see those male role models lost the words there, sorry. They have those role models there, and they also have the sort of older children coming in as well. Actively doing something about it, there are some, and it really is attempts, because it's still the case that not just that they're not necessarily keen to come in, but still society isn't quite ready for that. And there's a lot of suspicion around men in childcare for young children by themselves. So it's not just about a recruitment issue, it's very much more about how they're viewed.
Okay, thanks for that. Irene?
Well, I think in terms of, compared to the rest of the childcare and early learning workforce, there are slightly more men in out-of-school care. We do an annual workforce survey, and 8% of the returns are from men. And I think it's because the children are a bit older, and men might come from a youth work background, and we definitely want to see more men in out-of-school care and more men helping provide service. Another way they are involved is alongside women on the management committees. More than half of the standalone services, school-age childcare services, are run from the third sector. And men, I'd quite like to see this over the last maybe 7 or 8 years. There's more and more men involved in the committees. So rather than going into the out-of-school care committee and working with a whole group of women, we've now got fathers much more involved, and involved in discussions about quality of care for their children, and I'd like to see more of that.
Thank you for that. Marco Biaggi, you have an extra question?
It follows on very well from that. How much fundamentally of the problem for women and work are outdated and imbalanced perceptions of gender roles that see women as the sole automatic carer for children?
Yeah, Claire Simpson. Yeah.
I think hugely so. And I think, looking at European models, I just looked again at Children in Scotland's briefing, and where you see men and women more equal in the workforce, it tends to be because the childcare is better. I think even where women go out to work, there's for one, there is an assumption that it is a woman's responsibility, which I've already touched on. And, I think that has to move both in terms of the responsibility and in terms of how the cost is calculated, as Sarah said. I think that, in the Children and Families Bill UK, which is going through at the moment, I think it's sections 5, 6 and 7, which are about employment rights, about flexible working, about parental leave. Within that, there is something about paternity leave. And what the EHRC report had said was that where paternity leave is sort of dedicated to fathers, if you see what I mean, if there's specific rights for them and it's paid, then it tends to be taken. So, that's the case in Norway and Denmark, for example. What the UK government have elected to do in this bill is to go for a shared system of responsibility, a shared system of leave. And it's still going through Parliament at the moment, so it's not entirely clear how that works, and there's a huge amount of complexity in the consultation around regulation, around how the regulation and guidance will work. But what it seems like we'll be left with is a system that's a kind of half-best, that fathers will get a little bit of extra leave, possibly, and it depends who's the main earner in the family. I think if we were to go for a better system of paternity leave, it seems funny to be talking at this about, we're talking about women in work, but I think actually that might look at some of the equality gap that's there and encourage men both to take childcare responsibility and to be able to take time off with their children.
Does anyone else want to come in on that point? Sadhwa?
So I'd endorse that, and I think one of the models that if I'm getting it right, is worth looking at is Iceland, where I think that it might be shared, but there's actually, you're obliged to take it, both partners in a relationship. And a report I read a while ago said that that was one of the things that really influenced equality in the workplace. and sort of reduced the gender imbalance that there was around who took what leave. So I do think there is a role for legislation in how it can change behaviours and shift the culture and the cultural shift that's required for this to happen. And I think that's one of the things we need to look at, because I think until we have that, unfortunately, it will always be seen as the woman's responsibility.
Claire, did you want to come back in?
I just wanted to come back in and point out that working families who were given evidence earlier, they have a award system for family-friendly working practices, and one of them is for practices that are specifically father-friendly. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because the winner in one of the recent years was a Scottish example. It was the General Register's Office of Scotland. And I think, you know, it'd be interesting to look at them and find out what impact that's had on employment and occupational segregation and retention there.
Claire Telfer.
Just add a small point around, I think we quite often categorise different groups of people in relation to employment. Obviously this committee's inquiry is looking at women in work. We have policies that look at youth employment. What we maybe need to get to the point is starting to think about the family unit. So just picking up on what's been said, and we need to look at family employment and how families are supported. So I think it is really important that we look at the whole family unit and how that's impacting on children, and perhaps try and take a more holistic approach, and maybe not break down into sort of individual categories, and that could help us in terms of thinking through what needs to be in place.
As there are no further questions from committee, can I thank our panel of witnesses for coming along this morning. Your evidence will help us as we take forward our inquiry into women in work. I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow the room to clear, and I'll reconvene at 11:20. Thank you. Agenda item 2 this morning is a decision on taking business in private, and the committee are being asked to agree whether it would like to consider its draft report on women in work in private at future meetings. Do we agree to that? Yes. Thank you, that's now agreed. Agenda item 3 is on inquiry witness expenses, and in line with usual practice, members are invited to delegate me as convener responsibility for arranging for the SPCB to pay under Rule 12.4.3 any expenses of witnesses in its inquiry into women in work. Are we all agreed? Thank you, that's now agreed. Agenda item 4 this morning is on draft budget 2013 to 14 scrutiny. We have a paper and we are being asked to consider which response we want to make to this paper. We have three options. And I'd be interested in committee's views on which option we wish to pursue. Siobhan.
I'm fairly relaxed about any option. I mean, the first one would be my preference. But I was wondering if there would be a part in it that we could demonstrate our frustration at it being a tick-in-the-box exercise at times, particularly with other committees in the Parliament, looking at it in the scrutiny of how that goes. Because I know we discussed some of the responses we got back to our own scrutiny of the last budget, and if there was I mean, I don't know if this is possible, but if there were space in our own paper back to committee to make reference to that. Not a huge point, but just that it's there for people to note.
Yeah, I mean, my choice would also be the first option that we have under the recommendations at 8. For much the same reasons that you have mentioned. I am very aware that I don't wish equality to become simply a tick box exercise, and I think option 1 gives us a bit more influence or input into how equality is viewed. But I'm keen to hear other committee members' views, if there are any. Alex?
I'm inclined to agree with you for the same reasons as you stated, but the problem we have with taking that route is it's almost how long is a piece of string. This can be as big or as small as we want it to be, and I think we'd have to be fairly clear and concise about what our objectives were before we went into it, because it could just grow and grow and grow, and then not actually deliver very much if we're not careful.
Marco?
I would broadly agree. It's important that the equality statement is the result of a process that's been mainstreamed into the decision making, and as long as we get the balance right, it's a reasonable area to seek an update on.
John?
I would agree with that approach, not least because I think it would enhance the status of the equality statement if that's the focus around which we do an inquiry.
Dennis, John, any?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so do we agree that under the recommendations, the first recommendation is the one we wish to use in our response to the Finance Committee? Excellent. Thank you very much. That concludes today's meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 9th of May and will include further oral evidence on women in work. Thank you very much.